Rafael and Noel and Ann and Hilda and I don't know everybody's name yet at NALCAB, but I'm going to before this lunch is over. Thank you so much for having me. It's a treat to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about public policy, how we do public policy, why we do public policy, but mostly I'm going to talk very fast so that I can hear what you want me to talk about during a Q&A. So the following is less about the kind of the modern narrative of being a victim or personal storytelling, but it's to make a point, trust me. My father, after serving in World War II in Europe for 4 years for this country, came back, lived in Boston, and took some bookkeeping courses, tried to take some bookkeeping courses at Bentley College in Boston. And he was told when he enrolled that he could enroll and take the classes, but he couldn't use the school to search for employment afterwards. They didn't promote the hiring of Jews. We're Sephardic Jews, and he was a Jew, and no accounting firm was going to hire a Jew, and so it was a waste of time, and they weren't going to do it. It wasn't until I served as counsel on the Judiciary Committee 60 years later that I absorbed into my soul the role of the law on an incident like that. I'd spent my entire formative years seeing that as just a personal consequence, something that happened to families and something that happened to people, and it wasn't particularly unusual. It took working in Congress for the Judiciary Committee to see, oh, these are the fulanitos that make the laws, and how important it was to work with them so that the laws protected the things that were important to you. My mother, when my parents had their 6th child, me, they decided it was time for her to go to work in case something happened to him. And she opened up a kindergarten, and then she had 4 kindergartens in Miami, where we lived. And much like you're doing in your communities, it's a very direct service business, day in and day out. And it was a very poor neighborhood, and many of the children had government subsidies. And you had to limit how many you took. And we spent our lives as business people thinking that the limitations were your relationship with the contractor, with the county. And if the contractor liked you, you did well, and if they didn't, can you relate to that? It wasn't until I worked at a law firm in Washington as a lawyer and worked on Head Start public policy and the authorization of Head Start that I realized, oh, this is where the decisions are made about how much money in total would be available to this community. In 1980, anybody from Miami? Yeah, que viva Miami. In 1980, Fidel opened up the port of Mariel and said, I won't do the politics of it, but come pick up your scum, he said to the people of Miami. And my neighbors, my family didn't do it, but my neighbors literally got into boats and rafts and private planes if they had it, and went and picked up relatives and friends. And 125,000 people were picked up privately in a matter of weeks. It wasn't until I ran a division at the Department of Justice charged with legislation. I was the lobbyist for President Clinton and Attorney General Reno on the law, including the immigration law, that it really sunk into my bones that what was personal was actually political and policy. The importance, particularly for you, people who run organizations that are housing people, helping with savings, helping fight against abuse, every single day on the front lines, the importance that you also, yes, I'm going to burden you with more, the importance that you also focus on the policy that gets us into the situation we find ourselves fighting against, or preserving, if you like, the policy. Your knowledge base being on the front lines of improving people's lives in the Latino community and those who benefit from that, whether or not they're Latino, is crucial patrimonio, crucial knowledge, asset, intelligence, and capital that the nation has to rely on in order to make the appropriate laws. So I'm going to say two things. A little bit more about why we have to worry about public policy, but more importantly, how. How do you do it? You're already working 7 days a week. You don't have access. It's a corrupt system. We don't have money to contribute. These are the reasons that we hear about why people don't get involved. I hope I've made the case, you don't really have a choice. It's either you or somebody else making the laws, the rules, the regulations, the interpretations, and the court decisions that affect our communities. If you don't get involved to your full capacity, you are abdicating the results to people who are willing to get involved. That's what a democracy is. That's what pluralism is. I think you don't have a choice. I hope that you're affirmatively motivated and you want to be involved because you know you have something to offer and we have growing power. How do we change public policy? I work at a firm, three of my colleagues are here, Haley and Larry. Are we missing someone? Gabby Huesca. Thank you, Gabby, for all of your work in getting us here. There are 50 of us. We're in Washington, Los Angeles, and New York. And we work on public policy campaigns, reproductive rights, immigration, domestic violence, childhood obesity. We do a lot of corporate work too, and are happy to do that. But what every one of us does is run public policy campaigns. We are in the business of changing or preserving laws that we think work for constituencies that we care about. Many, but not all of us are lawyers. You certainly don't have to be a lawyer. There's a science to public policy and how laws are changed. Number one, well, before I get to one, from the heart, you have to have commitment and focus. You have to care. You see that all around you. You see it with the Tea Party, you see it with pro-choice, you see it with anti-life, anti-choice, pro-life. Passion. Passion is a useful starting point. But in the formula, there are 4 things. You have to have precise goals. So many of us come together and we largely agree with each other and we say we want something. But we're dealing with a churning system of people who either hear you differently or want to hear you differently. Your willingness to work together and frankly fight with each other, to have as much rigor and precision as possible about what do we want is crucial. If you are not precise about what you want, your opponent will hand you what they think you're saying. Many of us argued for years after the death of Thurgood Marshall that we wanted an African American on the Supreme Court. And we pushed and we fought for an African American on the Supreme Court. And President Bush handed us Clarence Thomas, who is an African American. And a huge, but not all, but a huge percentage of us because we meant something different than what we said. We meant we wanted an African American who more often than not followed either a pragmatic or ideological narrative that would have found him supporting affirmative action, that would have found him ruling that the 8th Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment might apply to certain executions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, shame on us. You got what you asked for. And the lesson is not to be mad at your opponent. The lesson is to be more rigorous and say what you want. So in our work, it is a fact. This is the second hardest piece of public policy advocacy. What do you want? And when a compromise is forced on you, what do you want? 2, who's your audience? Who delivers you what you want? And in a complex society, there are many audiences. There's the mass audience, there's the Latino audience, there's media, There are elected officials. They're federal, they're state, they're county, they're contract officers for a county. There are the courts. There are federal courts. There are state courts. Get it? It requires some precision, rigor, and frankly, sometimes making hard choices. But you have to focus on what audience you're dealing with when you're asking for something. It's not an amorphous expression out into the world. 3, this is the hardest part. What is your strategy? And by strategy, we mean, what's the intellectualism behind your work? The best efforts. And this is true for whether you are trying to get comprehensive immigration reform, which we are, or you're trying to get your 15-year-old daughter to clean her room. Hopefully not your room. That was Freudian. Sorry, I have a daughter. She's going to... What? You need a strategy. Whenever you have a defined goal and an audience to whom you are talking, you have to know what your strategy is. What do I mean by strategy? The civil rights movement, the classic civil rights movement for African Americans in this country, was mostly organized around a very effective, brilliant, and almost never discussed strategy. It was a strategy of nonviolence. No matter what they faced, the strategy was to demonstrate passive resistance and nonviolence, the effect of which was to show the man as an evil actor. And so the fire hoses in Birmingham and the billy clubs and the incarcerating of children were the tactics brought on by passive resistance that were communicated to the world of an outrage going on. But there was a strategy. It was nonviolence. Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, shame. Shame. The shame of practice and communicating to the world shame. Shaming the American public that this could go on in our fields. There are all kinds of strategies. There's an electoral strategy. We're going to vote in massive numbers. The Latino community is not yet in charge of that strategy. The man is in charge of that strategy. Virtually all of the conversation around the power of the Latino vote in this country is coming from people who are not Latino. It's the parties allegedly jockeying for the vote. It's commercial, consumer-facing organizations talking about the buying power. You don't yet see significant mobilization of the actual vote to demonstrate the carrot and stick. We could talk, and I could talk, and my colleagues could talk a lot about different strategies, but every campaign has to have a strategy. Our daughter's parents, her mother and I, did not operate with the same strategy to get our daughter to clean her room. And so our daughter, who was significantly more brilliant than either of us, was able to diffuse us and wedge us because we were not coherent to her and we were not on the same page as two political actors. The carrot is different than the stick. I'm not going to belabor that. The last piece that you need in effective policy work is sometimes the hardest for advocates like you, for people who do the work every day, and frankly, you're the country's experts on Latino asset building. Nobody knows more than you. The fourth crucial issue is effective communications. It is simply not good enough anymore to just say what you know. It might be at an EST workshop, but in public life, if you are not speaking a language that the audience is prepared to hear, At best, you're not speaking. At worst, you're hurting yourself. I'll go back to comprehensive immigration reform. If I am speaking, if I am a dreamer, and I am speaking to a group of people who are sympathetic to immigration reform and want to see it done, my goal is to raise their level of activity and emotion so that they do something. They contribute money, they vote, they talk to their elected officials. If I am talking to a group of people who don't want comprehensive immigration reform, there are too many of us, we're taking jobs, whatever is the objection, my passion, my tears, que mi abuela se fue, is counterproductive. They're happy about that. That's a dramatic example. But there are many, many undramatic examples that happen in life. You must have a narrative about what you want, which takes in mind the listener. It's not just your passion or, frankly, our narcissism. I'm just going to tell you what's going on in our communities. So those are the four components of meaningful public policy. Know what you want. Know whom will deliver it to you, who your audience is. Make sure that you're operating with a strategy, that there's an intellectualism behind how you organize yourself, and make sure that you're working with people that can help you with communications. I'm going to tell you a couple of random things we learn, not random in that they're trivial, but disconnected about what you learn when you're doing public policy. Leadership, whether you're leading an organization or leading a movement or leading an effort, has two components: vision and delivery, vision and execution, vision and management. Extremely few of us are excellent at both. If you are, you win. But most of us are not. The key in leadership is to go with your strong suit and to make sure you surround yourself with people who complement your weak suit. If you are visionary and you see where we're going to be, you must have someone at your side who helps the people around you get there. What many leaders tend to do is hire people who are just like us. They get us. And a common problem, particularly in not-for-profit life, is a group of people at the top who get each other, and then a lot of worker bees and a lot of coalition members who are missing something. Many of us, particularly minorities, a goal is to have a seat at the table. What do you want? We want to be called when they're doing something or talking about something that affects our community. Yes. Make sure you know what you're going to say when you're called, but yes, we want to be called. Some of the really big girl stuff in public life is to know exactly why you're not being called. Don't assume. You have to have the fortitude and the strength and the courage to find out why you're currently not being called. I had an extremely caustic uncle in Boston who was a butcher. And if you found out about a party that you weren't invited to, he would say, "Don't think your name didn't come up." Ouch. Which I didn't like as a child. But as an adult, it's a fantastic point. You have to find out whether they thought about you, and this is the bank, the foundation, the mayor. They thought about you and decided not to include you, or they didn't think about you. They're two very different problems, both solvable. But people operate on this presumption without actually knowing. Get the data. And the last thing I'll say, in public life, at any level, The hardest work when you're doing public policy is fighting with your friends. It's actually very easy to fight with your enemies. It's very constructive. You're rarely, unless you have a really dysfunctional life, you're rarely sitting down to dinner with your enemies. You're rarely sitting next to them in church. And so the fights across with adversaries are stylized. It's the fighting with your friends that's harder. You have a shared goal, and you disagree about tactics. You have a shared tactic. We do a dinner together, but we have different goals. People are very reluctant to fight with their friends. You have to. In order to move public policy, if you're not fighting, your coalition isn't big enough. And so the fortitude in leadership comes from figuring out a civil and constructive way to fight when everybody's right. When they're wrong and you're right, it's an easy and useless fight. You're not going to persuade them. They're not going to persuade you. It's when everybody's right. And so I encourage people who take on public life and policy and work in coalitions. You'll find yourself, if you're normal, wasting a lot of time trying to demonstrate who was right and who was wrong in an issue. It's frequently the wrong conversation. The right conversation is, okay, everybody's right. Now what are we going to do? And that's what separates the women from the girls. The ability to navigate through a situation when everybody's right. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to actually stop. I'm going to stop narrative. I'd love to hear, what the public policy issues are for you, what you'd like to talk more about, what's on your mind. We love, with great intensity and great passion, the work that we get to do, my 50 colleagues and I. We are the nation's only, by far, minority majority firm. We are 95% female and ethnic minority and gay. There's nothing like it in the nation. It brings challenges and it brings great joy. Among the great pieces of it are the opportunity to work with a lot of national minority organizations, go from good to great to excellent. It's hard. We are undercapitalized. We are taken for granted. We are crabs in a barrel, fighting with each other about that one piece, one slot at the table. It's complicated. But we have so many experiences over the years of helping organizations or leaders move to the next step. And so we come at this with tremendous passion and tremendous joy, tremendous exuberance. And thank you very much for the opportunity to work with you and help you do the work that you do.